My name is James Willits. I'm a history PhD student at the University of Colorado Boulder, and today I'm talking about the Cold War, comic books, and ways in which visual imagery around atomic weapons changed in comics over the course of the 1940s and early 1950s. My work has largely stemmed from the overlap between imagery present in atomic photography and early Cold War comics, both of which share key visual cues and thematic underpinnings. As a result, I'm building not just off the research of comic scholars like Frank Sass and Leonard Rifus, but also scholars of other visual mediums. In the iconic image of the mushroom cloud and the Cold War nuclear optic, John Harriman and John Louis Leibniz argue that atomic photography developed a positive, optimistic framing of nuclear visual imagery in order to explain the new atomic age to ordinary Americans. Because comics were heavily dependent upon photographic sources, and in fact illustrators used the photographs as the basis for representations of the bomb and the mushroom cloud, comic books allow us to demonstrate the reach of both atomic photography and the messaging behind the nuclear optic. My work then is an attempt to demonstrate how these images and the attached meaning behind them filtered into public consciousness. Comics also, however, demonstrate the limits of the atomic photographs, the nuclear optic that they built. And so finally, my work is about how, when, and why comic books broke free from the nuclear optic established in these images. Harriman and Leibniz argue that atomic photography came to be defined by three key traits which were present in all photographs distributed by the government, i.e., all of them. In an attempt to create a positive portrayal of the bomb, in order to reassure Americans about the dangers that such weapons posed, these photographs showed a structured absence of death and destruction, emphasized the formal perfection of the explosion itself, and contained the bomb within a closed circuit of military control. Because photographs were the most widespread medium, appearing in national newspapers and periodicals such as Life and Time, the visual images that were portrayed here are incredibly important and would become the locus for all subsequent portrayals of the atomic bomb. The nuclear optic, therefore, contributes to the development of meaning around the mushroom cloud by helping to define the visual parameters and by choosing what to include and occlude from these photos. Photographs taken of the explosion rising over the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not showcase the extraordinary level of destruction that took place. Indeed, pictures from the ground of these cities were not released in the United States until 1952. These early photographs remove the mushroom cloud from habitation and civilization. They take place in the sky, on remote Pacific islands, or in the desert, each emphasizing the remoteness and the safety that goes into these explosions. The fact that they are away from habitation and not hurting anyone. And this is mirrored in early comic books, which typically show atomic bombs as something that is more of an inconvenience than anything else. This second image here from Picture Parade shows a dog who has wandered into a nuclear testing site. He'll be fine after a couple of days. The first image, by contrast, shows the explosion over Hiroshima. However, it is only in the very bottom left corner that you can see any sign of the city itself. Instead, the explosion rises over a featureless plain, just as the second image does in the Nevada desert. Likewise, the nuclear optic causes you to imagine a mushroom cloud. And if you were to close your eyes, you would probably think of that rising stem and then spreading out overhead, that white cap. But the image that you have is not one single mushroom cloud, but a composite. And outliers weren't published. Photography increasingly sought to create images which fit into the established imagery of the mushroom cloud. Often, as the tests moved to the Pacific, these would include a Wilson cloud of condensed steam, spreading out in a halo-like effect around the stem. These would be framed at the center of the picture, the explosion taken at its most mushroom cloudiness. And great pains were taken to demonstrate the ways in which scientific progress and photography itself went hand in hand for these. Here we can see images taken from Action Comics 101. After Operation Crossroads, which moved the atomic explosions to the Pacific and saw photographers taking live pictures as it happened for the first time, we start to see the mushroom cloud and images that go along with it abandon the pictures from Hiroshima and Nagasaki and move towards these new images, which often feature a featureless plain of water beneath them. Here, the emphasis on skill and technology of the photographers in capturing these images is present, as Superman goes to the very heart of the blast. But there is also an emphasis on the transcendent beauty and power of the cloud, an appeal to the sublime and man's scientific power over nature. The third aspect of the nuclear optic is its containment within a closed circuit of military control. Here we see an image from Operation Buster Jangle, an atomic bomb test at the Nevada test site. This was the first US nuclear field exercise that was conducted with live troops maneuvering on the ground. Troops were 6 miles from the blast. This was taken in November of 1951. Here we have a similar image from Top Secret from Young Men 24, in which Captain America and Bucky Barnes, along with a nuclear scientist, stand watching a rising mushroom cloud. Comic book superheroes were frequently called on to help prevent the spread of the bomb and to reinforce the power of the military. Here, Captain America has defeated a Soviet spy called the Executioner in order to protect America's atomic monopoly. But a wave of superheroes would join him, including the Atomic Wizard, the Atomic Man, 2 Atom Men, the Atomic Thunderbolt, as well as a myriad array of spies and secret agents, all working to prevent the theft of atomic secrets by enemies both foreign and domestic. From 1945 onwards, comic books used visual imagery taken from photography in order to showcase both the visual portrayal of the nuclear bomb and also to reinforce the nuclear optic. However, these portrayals were determined both by genre, the date that they were released, and the audience that the comics were intended for. In Captain Marvel 66, Captain Marvel, Billy Batson's alter ego, possessing the power of a pantheon of gods, is faced with the spectre of atomic war. This story clearly subverts the nuclear optic at a time when this would have been impossible in nuclear photography, and was still almost inconceivable in American comic books. In Captain Marvel and the Atomic War, then, we see, in gruesome detail, the ruins of central Chicago. All but the tallest skyscrapers are burned away, and streets devoid of life are littered with flaming rubble and wrecked vehicles. Captain Marvel can only stare in horror at the ruins of the city, with the only evidence of other people on the page, a woman's arm poking out from beneath a pile of bricks, with a girl's doll lying just outside her reach. While other comics reference the dangers of atomic war only obliquely, Otto Binder and artist C.C. Beck hold nothing back. So while Harriman and Lukites write that the nuclear optic avoided any traces of death and destruction, comics pushed the envelope of what was acceptable. While continuing to look for survivors in Chicago, Captain Marvel rescues a woman and her baby from a burning building, only for them to die in his arms, the victim of radioactive burns. As Captain Marvel observes the devastation, he laments that it'll be the same all over. Not one soul is alive in Chicago. 4 million people, wiped out like flies. It's horrible, horrible, horrible. But this war is not confined solely to Chicago. Despite attempting to use his powers to redirect incoming missiles, by the end of the story, the world's mightiest mortal is the only survivor. The world responds to the first attack in a frenzy of score settling, using their own nuclear weapons on traditional enemies and utterly destroying humanity. Obviously, the complete annihilation of first a city and then the world does not fit into the atomic photography's idea of the nuclear optic. Fortunately for Captain Marvel, and for the readers who otherwise would have had little to look forward to in the next issue, the final page reveals that the entire story was simply an in-universe tale broadcast by Billy Batson. It was intended to demonstrate the apocalyptic consequences of nuclear exchange and to remind Americans of the danger of war. The comic features a meta exchange between a family of fictional broadcast viewers to finish. This forcefully puts across the writer's thoughts, whilst also serving as a lesson to the reader that the world just can't afford to have another war, because it could wipe out all civilization and all human life. Remember that, kids, the father finishes. Turning to face the reader, the family's son remarks that he guesses we'd all better learn to live and get along together so that the terrible atomic war will never occur. Captain Marvel's adventures fit into a post-war message that emphasizes, alongside the nuclear optic, that America's goal is to protect the peace by preventing nuclear proliferation. While it certainly subverts the nuclear optic that's present in photography, it does so with the intention of maintaining the third point, that military control over the bomb is paramount. And just as superheroes and spies resisted villainous attempts to claim the bomb, so must ordinary Americans do everything they can to avoid nuclear war, something which is contingent upon keeping the secret of the atomic bomb safe. In his address on foreign policy, President Truman swore to secure the atomic bomb as a sacred trust for all mankind. Even before the tests that confirmed the viability of the bomb, maintaining nuclear weapons as the sole preserve of the United States had become the most significant goal of American security. Government officials assumed that they would have at least a decade before the Soviets caught up, and that the United States could maintain its monopoly over the bomb in its current form. This was a weighty responsibility, and comics demonstrated a sense that protecting atomic secrets and stopping the spread of these weapons was America's role, not just to protect herself, but the entire world. Only in American hands could this power serve as the foundation of an atomic utopia, which many comics demonstrated would be the inevitable future outcome of the discovery of the atom and its splitting. As the developers of the bomb, Americans served as its custodians, and their chief duty was to prevent the spread. But then, in 1949, the Soviet Union tests their own atomic bomb, upending both the nuclear optic present in photography and the American exceptionalism that backed non-proliferation within comics. Comic book writers were confronted with a new reality, that America no longer had a monopoly on atomic weapons, and current events directly informed changing visual portrayals of the atomic power behind the bomb. Following the test of the Soviet bomb in 1949, world affairs seemed to turn against America and the West. The fall of China to communism, the outbreak of war in Korea, and rising fears of communist infiltration at home all contributed to a perception of a world in which global communism was in the ascendancy. In the face of these setbacks, the nuclear optic faced significant challenges as the idea of a tightly controlled, non-destructive bomb collapsed. Atomic War No. 1 included the title-dropping text from the cover that only a strong American can prevent atomic war, ending with the command that Americans look upon the pictures of our giant cities, hundreds of years in the making, smashed by the atom bomb, and say, "This shall not come to pass." This anxiety was reflected in comic books, which saw a sudden and steady rise in a new type of comic genre, apocalyptic stories of atomic war. In June 1952, St. John Publications put out the first issue of Atom Age Combat, and its success prompted a wave of imitators. In November, Ace Magazines put out Atomic War and followed its success with World War III. Subsequent titles included Atomic Attack, World War III, again, and Commander Battle and the Atomic Sub. While imagery of American cities reduced to radioactive ruins was shocking, these comic books typically argued that showing this was necessary in order to ensure that these dark futures didn't come to pass. They sought instead to demonstrate the need for rigorous national defense programs, thus creating a new nuclear paradigm which emphasized that proliferation, the early nuclear optics nightmare scenario, might not have to inevitably result in nuclear war. Instead, if America was strong enough, they could prevent that war from breaking out. 1951's If an A-Bomb Falls was an 8-page comic printed in the Washington Post in July and then distributed across the US. Hailed by federal civil defense coordinators as an example of ways that American media could reinforce the government's message, the comic attempted to disabuse the public that there was nothing that could be done in the event of a nuclear attack, and provided detailed strategies that could be followed both before, during, and after nuclear war broke out. Optimistic examples included keeping waste paper in covered containers at all times in order to limit the outbreak of fires, preparing for the dropping of an imminent bomb by drawing the curtains and unplugging appliances, while those outside should hide in a ditch or gutter, cover themselves in a coat or newspapers, and hold or tie a handkerchief over their mouth to avoid inhaling radioactive dust. While the comic concludes by noting that atomic weapons are the most powerful and destructive known to man, it suggests that proper shelter and knowledge of what is to be done could significantly reduce casualties. This optimism, however, would start to decline both in comic books and American society following the construction of the H-bomb, a far more powerful atomic weapon. In 1954, the successor to If an A-Bomb Falls, The H-Bomb and You, opens with a warning from a teacher that the film she is showing to her class might be real someday if we don't build a strong civil defense. Here, however, the act of preparing for a nuclear attack has escalated from establishing a shelter to the protection of our home front by civilians against military attack, a job for every man, woman, and child. Indeed, the comic now argues that the best defense against a nuclear attack is not sheltering in place or ensuring a fireproof home, but a well-trained, alert civil defense that backs up our military forces. Civilians could sign up for Operation Skywatch, a nationwide system of 24,000 observation posts designed to spot incoming aircraft that might avoid radar detection. Boys could do messenger jobs, light rescue work, or accompany patrols of the neighborhood, while girls might help by working in welfare centers, registering and feeding victims of bombings, or by taking a home nursing course in order to assist the injured. Mothers' duties, meanwhile, had increased from disposing of loose paper to maintaining a stockpile of food and equipment and learning how to purify water and put out fires. These post-war comics saw extensive distribution and, with state and federal support, garnered a wide readership. But the militarization of ordinary people, civilians, in order to meet the needs of the government, reflected the concerns of both that government and of the American people as a whole. As the perceived threat of communism increased, so did the pessimistic outlook of the comics, which struggled to maintain the idea that America would prevail, even as they urged the American people to commit themselves anew to the global struggle for freedom and democracy. The spread and increasing destructiveness of nuclear weapons allowed comic book writers to push alternative perspectives on the atomic age, breaking from the tightly controlled messaging of nuclear weapons contained within atomic photography. Comic books thus serve as both an important tool for examining the development of visual imagery around the bomb, its movement from scientific optimism to a need for non-proliferation and a belief in American exceptionalism, to finally mirroring American concerns about the threat posed by atomic war and communism. But they also give us an insight into how and when people's perspectives on atomic weapons began to change. Comic books themselves, however, finally return to a modified nuclear optic, which emphasizes obedience to authority and patriotic vigilance against foreign nuclear aggression in the 1950s. Thank you very much.